One of the major themes of this past summer's Superman movie is identity. Who is Superman? Is he who his Kryptonian parents meant for him to be when they sent him to Earth before Krypton exploded? Is he who Lex Luthor says he is? Is he who he himself thinks he is? A little over 20 years ago, writer Kurt Busiek and artist Stuart Immonen created a classic story premised on a question of identity. They asked, what if Superman was a completely different person altogether? What if an ordinary person in an ordinary world suddenly had those amazing powers and abilities? What would that mean? Who would that make them? The story, published over 4 issues beginning in January 2004, is called Secret Identity, and it begins in 1990 at the birthday party of a Kansas teenager named Clark Kent. Not that one. Different guy. I just told you that, remember? Completely different person altogether. This Clark Kent has parents named David and Laura Kent, and they named their son Clark because they thought it would be fun for him to go through his whole life as the guy with the same name as Superman. David and Laura are, based on this fact alone, either terrible parents who inflicted a lifetime of mockery on their child for their own amusement, or preternaturally amazing parents who knew they would get bored just raising a typical child and decided to give themselves a challenge. If I had to pick at this point, I'd go with option 1. The primary beneficiaries of Clark being named after Superman seem to be the other members of his family, who don't have to think too hard about what gifts to get him for holidays. They just buy him some more Superman merch. Get it? Clark Kent? I bet you love it. He hates it. In this world, much like our real one, Superman exists only in fiction. This Clark Kent isn't particularly interested in Superman. He resents Superman for quite understandable reasons, and though he receives each new Superman-themed gift with polite gratitude, when the party's over, he adds it to the pile at the bottom of his closet. Because of his name and because he's quiet and shy, Clark is targeted by bullies who taunt him, calling him Superboy. He doesn't have any close friends. Even the nerds at school only relate to him based on his name. They assume he must be an encyclopedia of superhero comics trivia. He isn't. When we meet this Clark, he's not unhappy exactly, but he's isolated. In an early bit of narration, he confesses that the qualities he envies about Superman aren't the powers, but the things that allow him to lead a normal life, having friends, not being picked on all the time. Then, suddenly, but this being a superhero story, inevitably, everything changes. Clark goes for a solo hike, one of his favorite activities. He enjoys being alone out in nature. And that night, while sleeping under the stars, he wakes from a dream to find himself floating high above the ground. Not just floating, flying. And not just flying. Clark discovers that he also has super speed, super strength, telescopic vision, super hearing. In other words, he has Superman's powers. How? Why? He doesn't know. But he knows it's not a dream. Somehow, it's real. At school, Clark uses his powers to confound his bullies, evading a punch from one with super speed and then playing it off like nothing happened. On the weekends, he flies to far-off mountains. He doesn't get cold anymore, so he can enjoy standing high on the slopes of the Rocky Mountains, dressed only in jeans and a flannel shirt. Clark is curious about where his powers come from, of course. He doesn't tell anyone about his newfound abilities, but he does try to feel out his parents, see if they know anything helpful. Is he adopted? Is there something different about him? That gets him nowhere. Mom and Dad treat him like any other adolescent in need of assurance and direction and behave accordingly. Clark's powers have made him even more socially isolated than he was before. He starts spending more and more time alone, high up in the sky, even during free time at school. It's during one of those flights that everything changes for him again. Flying over a town experiencing a catastrophic flood, Clark sees a man sitting on top of his car, far from the nearest rescue team, about to slip off into the water. Clark swoops down, carries the man to safety, and flies off, thinking he'd moved too fast for anyone to spot him. He's wrong about that. Lots of people spot him, and before he knows it, there's a story on the front page of the paper about him. A full-on media circus ensues. A reporter, Wendy Case, starts writing regularly about the Kansas Superboy. Hoping to enlist her help in finding out where his powers came from, Clark begins granting interviews to Wendy, though he's always careful to conceal his identity from her by standing in shadow, and he forbids her from recording him or taking his picture. He considers going public, announcing himself to the world, cashing in on his celebrity, but before that happens, he discovers a night vision camera in Wendy's hotel room and angrily flies away, feeling betrayed. A few days later, while flying, he gets buzzed by a pair of fighter jets. Clark decides to reveal himself as Superboy and to go all the way with it, dressing up in a Superman costume for Halloween and going to his hometown's street carnival. His intention is to demonstrate his powers in front of everyone. But before he can do that, a gas main explodes, throwing the festival into chaos. Clark leaps into action, flying people to safety at super speed. The last person who needs rescuing is Cassie, a classmate Clark has a crush on. As he's saving her, a crush of reporters gathers around. Then, pushing through the crowd, is Wendy Case, the reporter who originally broke the story. Wendy furiously declares, "I found him. This is my story. I flushed him out. He's mine." Realizing that somehow, he's not sure how, Wendy is responsible for the gas main explosion, Clark decides to sabotage his own public reveal. Once Cassie has crawled to safety, he intentionally allows the heavy beam he's been lifting to fall onto himself, convincing the onlookers that he doesn't have superpowers after all. Later, Clark reads in the paper that he wasn't able to save everyone. Some people were killed in the gas main explosion. Others were seriously injured. Bomb-making supplies were found in Wendy Case's car. She had done it, all to draw Clark out and get the story. Thanks to his dropping the beam on himself, no one thinks he has superpowers, but people do know that he saved Cassie's life, and that changes things for Clark. He's less socially isolated, he's not bullied anymore, and since he still has his secret identity, he's free to continue to explore his superpowers, to think and to ask questions about who he is, and to do so in private. Part 1 ends with Clark flying high above the earth, looking forward to the rest of his life. While down on the surface, a group of Men in Black types investigates the site of the gas main explosion, looking for clues about Superboy. One of them mentions that they've looked into the Kent boy and can cross him off the list. When Part 2 opens, we catch up to Clark as an adult. He's just moved to Manhattan and gotten a job as a writer at The New Yorker. His new coworkers tease him about his name, just like his high school classmates used to. It's still annoying, but less so than when he was a kid, and he figures it will get old to them pretty soon and they'll knock it off. Plus, he is Superman. He jumps in to lend a hand whenever he hears about a situation where his powers can help. He even wears the costume, though he also tries his best to stay out of sight. One night, while out with some of his coworkers, Clark meets a woman named Lois. His buddies from the office set them up. They thought it would be hilarious. Lois doesn't agree. She's been set up with too many Clarks in the past, and it's not funny anymore. Clark chases after her to apologize, and they have dinner and end up dating. Her name is Lois Chowdhury. She's an interior designer. She has a great sense of humor and an irresistible smile, and she and Clark share tastes in books and art. They get along great, and before long, they're inseparable. Lois is the missing piece to Clark's new life in Manhattan. He likes his job, he likes using his powers to help people, but now, finally, with Lois, he feels whole. And yet, he still holds her at a distance. They're close, very close, but he hasn't told her that he loves her, even though he does. And he hasn't told her that his name isn't the only thing he has in common with Superman. After a bit of soul-searching, Clark decides to tell her about his powers. But before that conversation happens, Clark is captured by some kind of military team and taken to a lab where he's subjected to experiments. We get snatches of dialogue from the scientists that hint at the origins of Clark's abilities, something about other subjects and a meteor strike, while a semi-conscious Clark hallucinates scenes from Superman comic books, imagining his captors as Lex Luthor, menacing Superman with kryptonite. Clark busts out of the water tank they've been keeping him in, and when he finds a room full of toe-tagged corpses, all of whom were apparently previous subjects in whatever this is, some of whom are babies, he flies into a rage and destroys the entire lab, dragging the guards to safety as the place burns. From that point on, Clark's life takes two parallel paths. Professionally, things are great. His job at the New Yorker leads to him landing a book deal. Personally, his abduction leads to him becoming paranoid and secretive. He begins wearing glasses, hoping that it will keep him from being recognized on the street by one of the people from the lab. He continues to save people as Superman, but he's more careful than he's ever been and stays away if he thinks he's being set up. He shouts at a coworker who makes a Superman joke. He grows distant from Lois, and they stop seeing each other. But Clark doesn't accept that. He has good reason for shutting Lois out, for not telling her his secret. It's safer for him, and it's safer for her. He has no idea who's watching him or how much they know about him. But he knows Lois gives his life meaning, and that's not something he's willing to lose. So he drops by her apartment one night, invites her to a rooftop picnic, and after they've eaten, he tells her the truth. He can fly. He's Superman. Lois is overwhelmed, but she understands. She tells him she was arrested for shoplifting when she was a teenager, and ever since, she's been worried someone will find out. It's not quite having a superhero secret identity, but she knows what it feels like to have something about yourself you don't want others to know. Clark knows he's putting them both at risk by bringing Lois into this part of his life, but if Lois is willing to take that risk, and she is, then so is he. So part 1 is about Clark discovering his powers and deciding to preserve his secret identity. Part 2 is about Clark meeting and falling in love with Lois and sharing his secret identity with her. Any guesses what happens in part 3? Superman family, anyone? That's right. In part 3, Clark and Lois have been married for a bit. Clark has published a couple of successful books. Lois has a job as a designer that takes her all over the world. They've settled down on an island off the coast of Maine where they're building their dream house. And right on cue, Lois gives Clark the good news. They're going to have a baby. Babies, actually. She's expecting twins. Clark is overjoyed, but that joy is soon followed by a heavy weight of worry. He's managed to stay one step ahead of the government agents that have continued to track and chase and set traps for him while carrying on with his activities as Superman, but now he's about to be responsible for 2 children. What if the government captures him again now? What if they find out who he is? What if they don't just take him? What if they take Lois and their children? He remembers those babies he discovered at the research lab years ago. He asks himself, could that happen to our children? For the sake of himself and his family, Clark resolves to make peace with the government. He intentionally flies into one of the traps they've set for him, takes out their weapons and surveillance equipment, and makes an offer to the agent in charge, Malloy. Stop chasing me, he says, and I'll help you out from time to time. He specifies no assassinations, no coups, but even with those kinds of jobs off the table, the government could certainly use someone like Superman. The government doesn't go for it. They attack him instead, but he gets away and decides not to give up. Clark uses his powers to infiltrate various high-security government installations, then sets another meeting with Agent Malloy. He tells Malloy that he's proven 2 things. First, that he can get to anyone in the government he wants, anytime he feels like it. And second, that he's not the government's enemy, because even though he could have hurt people and done damage, he didn't. Clark tells Malloy to back off. I'm not a threat, he says. All I do is save lives. Do you really want to change that? This time, Malloy takes the deal. They even set up a line of communication which the government can use whenever they need Superman's help. That is the deal, in fact. The government lays off, stops chasing and trying to trap Superman, and in return, when they call him for a job, he comes. It works out fine until Clark gets a call while Lois is in the hospital about to give birth to their twins. Lois reminds Clark of the deal and tells him to go. So he goes, and he helps the army rescue some Americans that had been taken hostage by a powerful international South American drug cartel. The job troubles Clark, not the rescuing of the hostages, but the timing of the mission, which was calculated to boost the popularity of the incumbent president of the United States before an upcoming election. Still, all goes well. Clark isn't there for the birth of the twins, but he hears it thanks to his super hearing, and he arrives back at the hospital to find Lois and their two newborn little girls safe and healthy. As he holds his children in his arms for the first time, he promises to do whatever it takes to keep them safe. As the fourth and final part begins, more time has passed. Clark and Lois's daughters, Carol and Jane, are grown now. It's Christmas, and they taunt Clark by giving him the latest in a long line of Superman ornaments, this one featuring Supes dressed as Father Time, complete with long white beard. The girls don't know his secret. They're just teasing him because of his name, as people have done his entire life. There's apparently no escaping it. He takes it in good humor. Clark is still operating as Superman, but things are changing. His government handler, Malloy, is asking for his help less often. Clark suspects there may be other, more agreeable, secret superpowered agents working with the government now. And Clark notices his powers starting to fade. He's still titanically strong, but not as strong as he used to be. He's slowing down, too, and his super hearing and vision require more concentration than they used to. The waning of his powers compels Clark to continue searching for an explanation of how he got them in the first place. He finds evidence of many possible causes: old Nazi eugenics programs, reports of gene mutations related to chemical weapons exposures, radiation polluting the water table following a series of meteor strikes. That last one seems to be the most likely explanation, since there were reports of meteor strikes in Kansas a couple of years before Clark's powers first manifested. But he's not sure. He has no facts, only informed speculation. Clark does get confirmation of another of his speculations. Those other superpowered agents he suspects are helping the government? It turns out he knows them. They're his daughters, Carol and Jane. He spots them from a distance, helping out during a tornado in Australia. Clark and Lois had wondered if their children would develop superpowers, had worried what would happen if they did, but it seemed like they didn't. As far as Clark and Lois could tell, Carol and Jane grew up to be typical, non-superpowered young women. Turns out not so much. After talking it over, Clark and Lois decide, reluctantly, not to tell Carol and Jane they know about their superpowers, at least not directly. Clark knows firsthand what it feels like to keep this kind of a secret, and how important it is to be able to choose who you share that secret with. The truth comes out in due course anyway. Clark swoops in to rescue a derailing train, and Carol and Jane show up too. Later, with Lois, they have a talk about it, and it turns out the stories of Carol and Jane aren't that different from Clark's. Their superpowers appeared when they were teenagers. They confided in each other, but decided to keep the secret from everyone else, including their parents, which made sense at the time since they didn't know Clark had superpowers too. They were never abducted by the government, like Clark was. They were contacted by someone who wanted to negotiate a role for them, and that was that. Life goes on. Clark's government handler, Malloy, summons him one night to announce his retirement. Malloy reveals that he's known Clark's real name for a long time, but hasn't told anyone else, and will be taking any personal information about Clark with him when he leaves. With Malloy's retirement, Clark's time as a government agent comes to an end. Decades further in the future, Clark is white-haired and bearded, a grandfather living in an age of flying cars and superheroes. More people with superpowers have emerged and now operate publicly. Clark is glad to see it, but he continues to preserve his own secret identity. He likes his privacy. He still uses his powers, flies around helping out with Carol and Jane, and with his grandson Perry, who also has powers. Oh yes, he has grandchildren named Clark, Jimmy, and Perry. So I guess the haha, our last name is Kent, like Superman. Isn't that funny? Sense of humor only skipped a generation. Clark's powers have continued to gradually fade. He's slower. He feels the cold now, so he flies in an insulated Superman costume. He's more aware than ever of the passage of time. But when he looks back on his life, he decides that it was a good one. And though he does find himself floating above the Earth, watching the sun disappear behind the planet to the west, when it's time to fly home, he turns and heads east to see the sun rising again. How do you tell one of the greatest Superman stories ever published when Superman's not even in it? Much of the criticism directed at superhero stories over the last few decades has revolved around the concept of deconstruction. Starting in the 1980s, writers of superhero stories became fascinated with deconstructing the characters and the tropes that defined the genre, taking the whole project apart, exploring it from different angles, questioning its basic assumptions, interrogating it to get to the truth about these so-called heroes and what they tell us about ourselves. Some of the best superhero stories of the last 40-plus years have been deconstructions. Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, Squadron Supreme. But the problem with deconstructing the genre, from the point of view of someone who likes the genre, is that if it becomes too commonplace, people stop telling straightforward superhero stories. To paraphrase something I once heard Denny O'Neil say, after you've taken everything apart, you need to put it back together. The genius of what Kurt Busiek and Stuart Immonen do with Superman's Secret Identity is that they find a way to do both at once. This is a story that deconstructs Superman, that strips away the rest of the DC universe and all the decades of accumulated lore, that removes everything but the essential idea of Superman, of superheroes in general, and then puts that idea under a microscope and asks us to ponder what it means and why it appeals to us and how would a real person handle it if they could suddenly fly and lift cars over their head and see and hear things that were happening on the other side of the world. And this is also a story about a superhero living his superhero life, doing superhero stuff. It's not conventional in terms of its plot. There's no villain. There's no world-ending threat to be defeated. There are no cliffhangers to hook us for the next issue. But it's a straightforward story about a guy who gains superpowers and spends his life using them to help people. The key that makes the whole thing work is Clark himself, because he's living out both sides of the story. He is the superhero using his powers to do good, as superheroes have done for as long as the genre has existed, and at the same time, he's trying to understand who he is, what he is, and why. He's a superhero who is deconstructing himself. For me, one of the most effective ways to break a story, to figure out what happens in it, basically, is to ask what would really happen to someone in the character's situation. Secret Identity is a marvelous example of this kind of writing. What would really happen if a normal teenager suddenly found themselves with superpowers? And if that normal teenager happened to be named Clark Kent, because his parents thought it would be funny to name him after Superman, the comic book character, what effect might that have on how that teenager deals with those powers and on what choices they make? Everything that happens to Clark in the story feels like a natural consequence of his situation and his choices. Nothing feels contrived. Even the fact that he, a man named Clark Kent, meets and falls in love with a woman named Lois reads as believable given the circumstances as presented. And the things that Clark and Lois worry about, for their own sakes and eventually for the sakes of their children, are the same sources of anxiety that real people have to deal with every day, with the added complication that Clark has superpowers. Most people in real life don't need to take the added precaution of digging miles and miles of underwater tunnels so they can fly around the world without the government tracking them and finding out where they live, but it's easy to imagine someone doing that if they were living a life similar to Clark's in the story. Busiek walks a fine line when it comes to establishing parallels between the Clark Kent of Secret Identity and the Clark Kent we've read about in Superman comics since 1938. The Clark of Secret Identity is from Kansas, though not from Smallville, because there is no such place. He marries a woman named Lois, but not Lois Lane. He is not a reporter for a newspaper, but he is a writer for a magazine and eventually an author of nonfiction books. Most of the more obvious similarities between this Clark Kent and the mainline DC Universe version of Clark Kent are the result of this Clark living in a world where everyone knows who Superman is. He meets Lois because his friends thought it would be funny to fix up their Clark with someone named Lois. He wears a Superman costume when he uses his powers because he's following Superman's example. Many of the ways in which Clark chooses to deal with his powers are the result of him following Superman's example. Because of this, Secret Identity is not merely a story about a person with Superman's name and Superman's powers, but also a story about Superman. What he means, his value, and the impact he can have on the lives of people. This Clark is his own person, with his own story, and I appreciate how that story unfolds with a sense of wonder that is maintained right through to the end. The sudden appearance of Clark's superpowers is treated as a mystery to be explored, not a question to be answered. By the end, after a lifetime of searching, Clark has, at best, a pretty good guess as to why he ended up with superpowers. The explanation isn't the point. How and why he got superpowers isn't as important as what he does with them. And yet, this Clark's life is also undeniably shaped by Superman. Clark himself doesn't directly acknowledge this. He dresses like Superman. He flies around the world using his powers to help people like Superman. He even starts wearing glasses as a kind of disguise like Superman. But he never expresses any gratitude toward the character of Superman. He's never seen embracing Superman, reading the comics, watching the movies. He seems to have no more than a general knowledge of or interest in the character. And this is for the best. It's another of the many smart decisions Busiek made when writing this story because it avoids the trap of being self-congratulatory. Secret Identity is a celebration of Superman, but it works precisely because it never actually seems to be playing that note. Busiek's writing is thoughtful enough and restrained enough to let the story speak for itself. I could go on praising the writing of Kurt Busiek all day, but as with all comic books, the writing is only half the story. The artwork by Stuart Immonen is just as crucial, if not even more so. Like Busiek, Immonen is a veteran of the comics industry who reached his greatest prominence in the 1990s. It was during that decade when Immonen established himself as one of the most important Superman artists, with significant runs on both Action Comics and the Adventures of Superman monthly title. When Immonen drew Secret Identity, he had been away from Superman for a few years, working on other projects, including Guerrilla Comics, an imprint of Image Comics he co-founded with several other prominent writers and artists, among whom was Kurt Busiek. Perhaps because it represents a return following a hiatus from the character, Secret Identity reads like the culmination of Immonen's work with Superman. Busiek's script has this quality too, but even more than the writing, Immonen's art feels like the work of someone saying everything he has to say about this character. Superman, the Superman we know, the baby from the planet Krypton, is not a character in this story, and yet he is everywhere in this story. He is present on every page, whether his image is there or not. Immonen's evocative, impressionistic style brings the world and the characters of this story to life through moody, emotional, sometimes dream-like panels. Even though he spent decades drawing superhero comics, Immonen's art has never been typical of the genre. He doesn't work in the clean lines, sculpted figures, and crisply rendered action scenes you might expect from a Superman book. His pages are painterly, with deep shadows and hints of details that aren't actually visible. The contrast of his distinctive style with the look of more conventional superhero comics comes into play in this story and pays off in a beautiful and unexpected way. As the 4 parts of Secret Identity unfold, a pattern emerges. Each issue begins with a detail from a Superman comic or piece of Superman-related merch. The image is printed in halftone, and it ends up having some significance related to the events of that issue. It's a good gimmick. It contrasts the Clark of this story with the Clark/Superman of the mainline comics. It reminds us that this Clark is ambivalent at best towards Superman, but then, in issue 4, it becomes something more than a good gimmick. Clark is an old man, dressed up as Superman, flying alongside his daughters and his grandson. As he flies, he thinks back on his experiences, and his memories are shown printed in halftone, like details from Superman comics. The night he discovered his powers, the time he told Lois the truth about himself, flying with Lois while she was pregnant with the twins, flying alongside his grown daughters, and finally soaring high above the planet as his bearded, white-haired, present-day self. His life has become a Superman comic book, which, from our point of view, it always was. Secret Identity is a complex and sophisticated work, but for me, the best thing about it is how simple it is when you get down to the bottom of it. What is Clark Kent's secret identity? The answer to that question here is the same as it is in the pages of Action Comics and on TV and on the big screen. Clark Kent is Superman. The details are different, but the truth is the same. In all the ways that matter, the Clark Kent of Secret Identity is Superman. And it's not because of his name or the costume he wears or even ultimately the superhuman things he can do. It's because of how he chooses to live the life he has been given. That's what makes him who he is. And whether or not any of us ever acquire powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men, hopefully we will choose to live our lives in a similar way. Then we can also be Superman. Maybe even the best Superman ever.